Well, we are well into August, which we are calling Unity Heritage Month, which is in honor of our two co-founders, Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, who both happened to be born during the month of August. And so I thought that since we have 5 Sundays in August, we ought to work with our 5 basic Unity principles. Let's do one each Sunday during the month because these principles provide a good synopsis of our core teachings in Unity. And it's important to know that we don't take these as a creed. They are not a statement of faith. Nobody has to sign on to these, but what we found is that people who resonate with what these principles are talking about tend to find it easy to find a home in Unity. So we started 2 weeks ago with the first principle, which is this one here, which says that God is the name we give to the source and essence of all that is. There is no other enduring power. And from there we moved into the second principle. If God is the name we give to the source and essence of all that is, then human beings may properly be called manifestations or expressions of God. Today we move into our third principle, which says, the way we think directly influences the way we experience the world. Short and sweet. And one of the things that we're doing with our principles is we are delving into the underlying question. Each one of these principles is an attempt to answer a question. And so today's principle is addressing the very important question, what is the nature of consciousness? And I have another question. Is there an answer to that question? Because that's a tough one, but I'll tell you what, not too long ago I just happened to stumble across an interesting definition I've never heard before. It's short, it's sweet, short and sweet enough to go on a bumper sticker, which I think it has. It's this one. Consciousness. The annoying time between naps. And for you dog people out there, you can substitute an image of a dog because they do the same thing, right? They take a nap and then they get up and they bolt their food because they're late for their next nap, and you know the whole thing goes on and on like that. Wouldn't you like to be a cat? That'd be great. So I guess that's one way of looking at it, but to be perfectly honest, the best answer to the question of what is the nature of consciousness is, we don't know. We don't really know. There's no consensus. And yet consciousness is a word we throw around a lot, especially in Unity. We say things like Christ consciousness, higher consciousness, prosperity consciousness, lack consciousness, error consciousness, spiritual consciousness, sense consciousness. It's all consciousness, right? On and on and on. And we do have a shorthand definition in Unity about consciousness, which goes like this. We say that consciousness is the composite of all of the ideas, thoughts, emotions, sensations, memories, and knowledge held in mind, both conscious and subconscious. It's a pretty good definition. But I have to say that it's only a partial definition because what we're really talking about there is content, right? We're only talking about the content of mind or the content of consciousness. We're not talking about what it is that consciousness is or why consciousness seems to necessarily arise from this life form that we are. Nobody has an answer to that question yet, at least not a satisfactory answer to that question. But we have to start somewhere, and the fact of the matter is that our entire experience of life is totally dependent on the thoughts, the emotions, and the memories that make up what we think of as the human consciousness. But is that all that there is to it? Because again, that's another limited or partial definition. Is consciousness just limited to my human experience, what I think of when I talk about the word consciousness, what I'm referring to when I talk about my experience of consciousness? And that's one of the questions that comes up for me over and over and over again, and it has for years. What is the meaning of consciousness before there was any life whatsoever in the universe? That's how we get going. If I refer to God, for instance, as mind or consciousness, I am probably imagining something like my human experience of mind or consciousness. And yet, is that entirely valid? Am I justified in imposing that upon the rest of the universe? I mean, how could it be true that it's like my experience if there was no life, and especially no human life, for billions of years after the Big Bang that we all know about, which got the whole thing rolling? That's the challenge. Can we even imagine what it would be like in the universe before life emerged? Can we imagine what consciousness would be like before life emerged in the universe? And we can imagine a lot of stuff, we can make a lot of stuff up, but where's the frame of reference? Think about it. What, if anything, would it be like to be a star? Or a protoplanet? Or a cosmic dust cloud, or any of the other things that go into making this universe and creating and causing this creative process to forge ahead? There's certainly nothing like the human experience of consciousness. And yet, you think about it, the planets, the stars, they're composed of elements that are made of molecules, which are made out of atoms, which are made out of subatomic particles that interact and react according to natural laws that we can now discern and understand to a degree and manipulate and use for our own benefit. We can use the laws of the universe to create using the raw materials around us. That's pretty remarkable. That makes us co-creators, and yet we don't understand the mystery of our own experience of consciousness, much less any idea of consciousness that we can apply to that vast universe that is nothing like biological life. That's a conundrum. Well, the mystery of consciousness, that's the title of the talk today, and it's a title that I used once before back in 2009, and since then I've noticed that it's the title of a book that we're going to be working with here. It's the title of chapter 2 of this book here called Waking Up by Sam Harris, and this is the book that we're going to be working with during our mindfulness class, which is starting on September 14th. Now, here's what Sam Harris has to say about the mystery of consciousness. He's a neuroscientist, he's a philosopher, studied Buddhist meditation, and here's what he has to say. He says, investigating the nature of consciousness itself and transforming its contents through deliberate training is the basis of spiritual life. Now remember, this is an atheist speaking, and he makes no apologies. He claims that he is an atheist. He goes on to say, in scientific terms, however, consciousness remains notoriously difficult to understand or even to define. And he tries awfully hard in chapter 2 and goes through a lot of different examples, and none of them turn out to be really satisfactory. So his conclusion is that because our experience of consciousness, what it is to be human, what it is to experience consciousness from the human perspective, is so subjective, he says that spiritual practice is essential for understanding the human mind and consciousness. He says that no one can seriously doubt the existence of consciousness. And he says that consciousness is the one thing in the entire universe that cannot be an illusion. That's a powerful statement, because I think what he might be saying here, at least the way that comes across to me, is that he's saying that consciousness is the only thing that we can know for absolutely certain. And if you sit down with a philosopher sometime, they will guide you through an exercise where they will show that all sorts of different phenomena that come into our awareness could possibly be an illusion, but the one thing that they can't disprove as an illusion is consciousness. That's what Descartes was getting at when he said, I think, therefore I am. I cannot doubt the existence of my own experience of consciousness. That's a big deal. That's a big deal. Now, I know several of you have told me that you're reading this book, and in particular this chapter, but probably the entire book is going to require a couple or 3 or 4 readings to really be able to take it in, those of you who are getting into it. But again, what I hear him saying in this chapter is that consciousness is ultimate. Consciousness is ultimate. Even though we can't explain it, he says that, here's another quote, he says, consciousness is what matters to us, not just for the purpose of spiritual practice, but in every aspect of our lives. Consciousness is the substance of any experience we can have or hope for now or in the future. It's pretty dang comprehensive, isn't it? The important aspect of this, and I think maybe the most important aspect of all of this, is that consciousness is what gives our lives a moral dimension. Once again, Sam Harris, he says, without consciousness, we would have no cause to wonder how we should behave toward other human beings, nor would we care how we were treated in return. The universe, operating without us, doesn't care. An asteroid crashes into the earth, wipes out all of the dominant forms of life on this planet. You know, the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs, right? Nobody around at that time to call it good or evil. It just is, or it just was. Insofar as we know, we are the only ones who care. We're the only ones who care. We're the only ones who would try to prevent such a thing from happening if we were able. Think about that. Even now, we watch the skies for rogue asteroids that might pose a threat. And if one is coming for us, well, there's not a whole lot we can do about it yet. But we're learning, we care, and we try to preserve life. And as far as we can tell, that kind of moral dimension does not happen in the absence of consciousness. It's a big deal. He concludes in this chapter saying that on the mystery of consciousness, he says, many truths about ourselves will be discovered in consciousness directly or not discovered at all. Well, Unity co-founder Charles Fillmore took that exact approach. He decided that any kind of spiritual truth would have to be discovered in consciousness directly or not discovered at all. I had the honor of speaking at the Spirit Wind class this last Thursday where they're exploring unity, and the topic was Charles Fillmore. So I got to tell that wonderful little story about how the ever-skeptical Mr. Fillmore reacted to all of the competing ideas in religion and spirituality, all the competing and actually contradictory claims that were being made by religion back in his day. And in the face of that, he made a personal declaration. He said to himself, if I am spirit, and this God they talk so much about is spirit, we can somehow communicate, or the whole thing is a fraud. In other words, it's going to require a direct examination of consciousness. If we don't find it there, we're not going to find it at all. It's a fraud. It's exactly what he was getting at. He had a term for it. He called it going to headquarters. That was his way of a direct communication or a direct discovery via consciousness was going to headquarters, and it was a contemplative practice. Every day, a certain time at night, he would engage in a dedicated practice of meditation or contemplation, which is what led to his concept of God eventually. Charles Fillmore, when he talks about God, you will often hear him use the word mind with a capital M. He'd use that as synonymous with God. Thoughts, mind, they go together. And he said this. He said, by the term mind, we mean God, the universal principle which includes all principles. God is the original mind in which all real ideas exist. A universal principle which includes all principles, which would have to be the sum total of all the natural laws known and even unknown as of yet to us. Those same natural laws that we can discover and manipulate to be co-creators, it's all part of that same package. Everything that can exist according to those laws does exist in principle and in potential, going back to the beginning of time. So, Charles Fillmore would conclude, and he does, that things like human consciousness and morality are all real ideas which existed in principle at and before the moment of the Big Bang. If I'm understanding all of this correctly, and I've devoted a heck of a lot of time to it, but this seems to be what he is saying, that things like consciousness, not just human consciousness, but consciousness period, and morality are all real ideas which existed in principle at and before the moment of the Big Bang. And so I hear echoes of Albert Einstein in all of this. Isn't that strange? Albert Einstein was the guy who said, I want to know God's thoughts. I want to know how God created this world. I'm not interested in this or that phenomenon. In the spectrum of this or that element, I want to know his thoughts. The rest are details. The rest are details. And it's interesting that Einstein used the word God freely, even though he was very clear about the fact that he did not believe in a personal or a supernatural God. By today's parlance, we would call him an atheist. Einstein considered himself to be a student of the great philosopher and theologian Baruch Spinoza. Einstein once said, we followers of Spinoza seek out God in the wonderful order and lawfulness of all that exists, and in its soul as it reveals itself in man and animal. And not surprisingly, in some of his writings, Charles Fillmore speaks with admiration for Spinoza. So these are the ideas that attracted me to unity in the first place, and it's what keep me coming back. This is what we're about in this movement. We're exploring these ideas, not just because it's, geeks like me have a lot of fun doing it. It's interesting, I find it fascinating, but it's practical and it's beneficial. So let's get back to the book we started with. Waking Up. Sam Harris once again. He says, yes, the cosmos is vast and appears indifferent to our moral schemes. But every present moment of consciousness is profound. In subjective terms, each of us is identical to the very principle that brings value to the universe. Experiencing this directly, not merely thinking about it, is the true beginning of spiritual life. Let's leave that up there for a minute. Everybody comes to spiritual practice with a background question, right? And I'm sure that the background question is this. What's in it for me? Right? What do I get out of all of this? And it's a legitimate question. Right there's your answer. Finding out what it's like to be identical to the very principle, there's that word again, identical to the very principle that brings value to the universe. I've never heard it put quite that way before. I think it is an excellent new perspective. This kind of experience is powerful. Not in ways that we often think of as powerful. I've been teaching meditation and mindfulness for years, and there's this idea that, you know, we're going to see, you know, pink angels or unicorns dragging rainbows and stuff like this. And you know, it doesn't work like that. But it will change us completely. Because it's the key to shifting from a consciousness of whatever it is that's causing us difficulty, consciousness of lack, victimhood, powerlessness, unworthiness. It's a key to shifting from that kind of thing to this idea of being co-creators. And what we are co-creating with principle is the very best experience of life that we are capable of imagining, but not just for ourselves alone. That's the most important thing. Has to open up to others. If this expansion of consciousness doesn't also expand our circles of caring and compassion, then forget about it. It's worthless. But it has a funny way of doing exactly that. As we get into our own subjective experience, and if we do it, then we let go of our preconceived notions, we will find that we are opening up wider and wider, bigger and larger circles. So that's what waking up is all about. That's the power of exploring this mysterious thing that we call consciousness. And talking about it like this, reading books about it, it's all a really important part of the process. Do that. It's meant to pique our curiosity. It's meant to motivate us to take action. After that, we have to make the effort to get to the direct experience, and we have a tendency as human beings to make it much harder than it has to be. Getting back to what I was just talking about. We have these expectations. The heavens are going to open up and whatever is going to happen. And part of the reason for that is because that's the way the mind works. It's the illusion that we are a separate self, trying to control everything that happens and commenting on everything that arises. And of course the other problem is that our human culture around the world has romanticized and idealized this experience by using words like enlightenment, nirvana, perfection, saints, ascended masters, and stuff like that. Forget about it. Forget about all of that stuff. Let me tell you, if Charles Fillmore can go to headquarters, so can we. And we'll talk more about that next week. See you later.